The Vietnam War wasn't just fought in the jungles and rice paddies, it was fought in the shadows. Decades later, historians and declassified files have revealed a trove of hidden operations, covert agendas, and untold stories that rarely make it into the history textbooks. Many of these revelations paint a very different picture of the war, suggesting that the conflict was far more complex and more deceptive than the public knew at the time. This video will uncover some of the most shocking secrets of the Vietnam War that you were likely never taught, from clandestine CIA programs and political treachery to suppressed atrocities on the ground. What really happened in Vietnam, and why do so many questions about the war remain unanswered? Let's dive into the shadowy side of one of history's most controversial wars. And we know that sometimes the most important thing a conspiracy theory can do is fail, because in failing, it shows us just how solid the ground beneath our feet actually is. The phantom centuries never existed, but our ability to prove they didn't, that's as real as the rings in an ancient tree, as undeniable as an eclipse traced backward through time, as solid as the stones of Aachen Cathedral still standing after 1,200 years. That's the truth we can hold on to. That's the history worth believing in. Not because someone told us to, but because the universe itself confirms it with every test we can devise. The year is 2025. We are not living in a lie. We are living in the long, complicated, messy, beautiful reality of human history. All of it, phantoms be damned. One of the biggest Vietnam War secrets is that the fighting extended far beyond the borders of Vietnam through covert operations. While American news outlets showed images of battles in South Vietnam, an entirely secret war was raging in neighboring countries and behind enemy lines. Throughout the 1960s, the CIA ran a massive covert war in Laos, a country officially neutral. CIA officers raised a secret army of indigenous Hmong tribesmen to combat communist Pathet Lao rebels and North Vietnamese units operating on Laotian soil. American operatives and pilots, often flying with the CIA's own airline, Air America, directed these proxy forces. The US bombed Laos relentlessly in secret, dropping over 2 million tons of bombs on Laotian territory from 1964 to 1973, making tiny Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. None of this was publicly acknowledged at the time. The operation was so clandestine that American pilots who died in Laos were often listed as dying in Vietnam. This secret war only came to light years later, revealing how the conflict had spilled into Laos without the American public's knowledge. Similarly, the US conducted a covert bombing campaign in Cambodia. Starting in 1969, President Nixon approved Operation Menu, a series of B-52 carpet bombings targeting North Vietnamese sanctuaries just over the Cambodian border. These airstrikes, codenamed Breakfast, Lunch, Dinner, and so on, were kept hidden from Congress and the public by falsifying records. The missions were reported as strikes inside Vietnam. For over a year, American leaders denied bombing Cambodia, even as thousands of tons of explosives rained down on remote Cambodian jungles. The truth only emerged in 1973, sparking outrage. Along with bombing, the US later launched a ground invasion of Cambodia in 1970, the Cambodian incursion, also initially cloaked in secrecy. All of this expanded the war beyond what Americans were told, fueling chaos in Cambodia that helped set the stage for the Khmer Rouge's rise, a dire consequence of secret decisions. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MAC-SOG, was a top-secret special operations unit that carried out covert missions deep behind enemy lines. SOG teams made up of US Green Berets and select South Vietnamese or other allies slipped into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam to sabotage supply lines like the Ho Chi Minh Trail, gather intelligence, rescue downed pilots, and ambush enemy units. These missions were incredibly dangerous and classified. Washington denied that American troops ever operated in Laos or North Vietnam, even as SOG commandos fought and died there. The existence of SOG and its cross-border raids was one of the war's best-kept secrets, only declassified long after the war. Their exploits, including wiretapping enemy communications and planting booby-trapped ammunition in Operation Eldest Son, read like something out of a spy novel, yet they were very real. The U.S. also recruited Montagnards, indigenous mountain tribes in Vietnam's Central Highlands, as well as other ethnic minorities to fight in irregular units. Special Forces teams worked with these groups on clandestine missions. In Laos, thousands of Hmong tribesmen were armed and led by CYA case officers against communist forces. These proxy fighters operated in the shadows, without uniforms or conventional military command, forming the backbone of America's secret ground forces in parts of Southeast Asia. Their heroic and tragic contributions remained largely hidden for decades, since officially the U.S. was not in Laos or conducting these kinds of guerrilla operations. Together, these covert wars and operations reveal a pattern. The Vietnam War was not confined to what the public saw or what officials admitted. Entire campaigns were launched in secret. The American government expanded the conflict behind closed doors, deceiving not only the enemy but its own citizens about the war's true scope. These secret wars also had lasting consequences. Laos and Cambodia were devastated, with unexploded ordnance still littering the land today. Yet for years, they were simply written out of the conventional narrative of Vietnam. Even within South Vietnam, the United States orchestrated secret operations that blur the line between military action and covert assassination campaign. Chief among these was the Phoenix program, a now infamous but initially clandestine initiative run by the CIA along with U.S. Special Forces and South Vietnamese units. Phoenix, known in Vietnamese as Phung Hoang, was designed to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, that is, to identify, capture, or kill the civilian supporters and underground operatives of the Viet Cong insurgency. Starting in 1968, Phoenix created clandestine counter-terror teams and intelligence networks to root out local Viet Cong agents, spies, and sympathizers in villages. In practice, this often meant abduction, torture, and targeted killings. Phoenix operatives compiled blacklists of suspected Viet Cong political cadre. Thousands of South Vietnamese civilians were then arrested or killed on suspicion of aiding the enemy. By 1972, the program claimed over 80,000 Viet Cong members neutralized, including over 20,000 killed. U.S. officials at the time described Phoenix in sanitized terms as a coordination of intelligence and local security, but in reality it became an assassination program notorious for abuses. Interrogation centers set up by Phoenix used torture techniques to extract information, and bounties or quotas sometimes led to innocent people being caught in the dragnet. At the time, Phoenix was highly classified. It operated in the shadows, and American commanders even denied its existence when rumors of assassination teams began to surface. Only later, through congressional hearings and whistleblowers, did the grisly details come out. The revelations were shocking. Members of the U.S. military and CIA had been directly involved in systematic torture and murder of civilians under Phoenix. The program's defenders claimed it successfully disrupted the Viet Cong's undercover network, possibly shortening the war. But its legacy is dark. Phoenix contributed to the climate of fear and lawlessness in the countryside. For many Vietnamese villagers, the Americans became as terrifying as the enemy Viet Cong. This is not a chapter of the war that history classes dwell on, yet it's a stark example of how far the U.S. went in a secret campaign to destroy the insurgency from within, essentially by terrorizing the terrorists. Phoenix remains one of the most controversial and little taught aspects of the Vietnam War, emblematic of the war's moral quagmires. Some of the biggest secrets of the Vietnam War lie not on the battlefield, but in the halls of power in Washington. American leaders repeatedly deceived the public, and sometimes Congress, about the war, shaping a false narrative to justify or sustain the conflict. These deceptions weren't fully understood until years later, when leaked documents and tapes pulled back the curtain. In early August 1964, President Lyndon Johnson told the American people that North Vietnamese patrol boats had launched an unprovoked attack on U.S. Navy ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. This alleged attack, specifically a second attack on August 4, 1964, was used to urge Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, effectively giving Johnson a blank check to wage war in Vietnam. What Americans weren't told is that the evidence of the second attack was highly dubious. In fact, we now know there likely was no second attack at all. Navy sonar and radar reports were chaotic and contradictory that night. Many in the chain of command doubted anything had actually happened. But Johnson and his advisors were eager to retaliate and rapidly seized on the sketchy incident as a casus belli. Intelligence was skewed, and facts were fixed to make it seem like a clear-cut North Vietnamese aggression. Essentially, the administration misled Congress into authorizing a massive escalation of the war on what was, at best, an incorrect narrative, and at worst, a manufactured pretext. It wasn't until declassified NSA documents and internal tapes surfaced decades later that the full truth emerged. Johnson privately admitted, "For all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there." The Gulf of Tonkin incident stands as a stark secret of Vietnam. The war's major escalation began under false pretenses. In 1971, a bombshell set of documents known as the Pentagon Papers was leaked by whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. This top-secret Defense Department study detailed how multiple U.S. administrations had systematically misled the public about Vietnam. The papers revealed many truths that were never taught. For example, they showed that the U.S. government had been involved in Vietnam's conflict long before it admitted, sending naval raids and commandos against North Vietnam in secret, while denying such escalations publicly. They also documented that early on, Johnson's administration doubted the war was winnable, even as it told Americans victory was on the horizon. Perhaps most damning, the Pentagon Papers confirmed that officials knew the war was going badly, but kept painting a rosily optimistic picture to the public. They exposed the credibility gap, the difference between reality and what leaders said, on everything from enemy troop counts to the purpose of the war. For instance, the papers showed that a primary motive for fighting was not to help a friend, South Vietnam, but to contain China, a strategic reasoning not shared with the public. The publication of the Pentagon Papers was itself an explosive event. The Nixon administration tried to suppress them, which led to a Supreme Court case about press freedom. Ultimately, the truth came out. The American people had been repeatedly lied to about the conduct and prospects of the war. This secret history, once unmasked, fueled a deep distrust in government that lingers to this day. One lesser-known saga involves Richard Nixon before he was president. In 1968, as a candidate, Nixon allegedly interfered behind the scenes to derail peace negotiations that were underway in Paris. At the time, President Johnson was attempting to broker a peace or at least a bombing halt to boost the chances of ending the war. According to now verified evidence, FBI wiretaps, notes from Nixon's aides, Nixon's campaign secretly contacted the South Vietnamese leadership and urged them to boycott or delay the peace talks, promising they'd get a better deal once Nixon was elected. This clandestine maneuver, known as the Anna Chennault affair, undercut Johnson's efforts, and indeed, the South Vietnamese government pulled out on the eve of the 1968 election. Johnson was reportedly furious and called it treason. However, he chose not to expose Nixon's actions publicly, partly because the evidence came from secret surveillance. Nixon went on to win the presidency, and the war dragged on for years, costing thousands more lives. This shocking political secret only became widely confirmed decades later. It suggests that a US politician put election ambition above an earlier end to the war, a deeply cynical move that the public knew nothing about at the time. It's a sobering thought. The Vietnam War might have been shortened in 1968 if not for behind-the-curtain betrayal. Yet this isn't something you'll find in standard history textbooks. Nixon, once in office, pursued something he called the madman theory. Essentially, he wanted North Vietnam and the Soviet Union to believe he was crazy enough to do anything, even use nuclear weapons, to win if peace wasn't achieved. In 1969, Nixon even ordered a global nuclear alert, a top-secret operation called Giant Lance, sending nuclear bombers near Soviet airspace to rattle the nerves of the communists. This nuclear brinkmanship was kept utterly secret. The American public had no idea how close to the edge things got. North Vietnam wasn't cowed by the ploy, they suspected a trick, but the fact that the US president toyed with nuclear war in secret is chilling. It only came out later when documents and insiders revealed these tactics. It's another example of Vietnam's hidden dimension. Decisions of enormous consequence, even apocalyptic ones, were made in secrecy, far from democratic oversight. In sum, the political history of the Vietnam War is rife with deception. From the very origins of direct US involvement, based on a phantom attack, to the prolonged stalemate sustained by rosy lies, and even active subterfuge against peace efforts, Americans were not given the full truth. These secrets and lies eroded trust in government once they were uncovered. But for years, citizens and soldiers alike were fighting a war under false impressions, a fact that remains one of the most tragic lessons of Vietnam, seldom taught but never more relevant. Beyond the big strategic lies and secret operations, the Vietnam War also featured astonishing programs and weapons that were kept hidden at the time. Some of these sound like science fiction or conspiracy theory, but they really happened. The US in Vietnam experimented with unconventional warfare techniques, ranging from climate manipulation to psychological tricks, many of which remained classified for years. Imagine using the weather as a weapon. It sounds impossible, but during Vietnam, the US military actually did this in secret. From 1967 to 1972, the Air Force ran Operation Popeye, a top-secret weather modification program. The goal was simple: make it rain, a lot. US planes seeded clouds with silver iodide over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the crucial supply routes running through Laos and Vietnam, to extend the monsoon season and turn the trails into mud. The slogan was literally, "Make mud, not war." By creating heavier rainfall and flooding, the US hoped to slow enemy troop movements and supply convoys. This effort at weather warfare was kept under wraps. Even the Secretary of Defense at the time was not fully informed, and he assured Congress no such weather weapons existed. But they did. Operation Popeye managed to increase rainfall in targeted areas for a time, though how much it hampered the enemy is debatable. The program came to light when reporters and the Pentagon Papers exposed it in 1971 to 1972, shocking many. It led to international debate and eventually a UN treaty banning environmental modification as warfare. Still, the fact that American forces literally played God with the weather in Vietnam is a secret slice of history that most people have never heard of. The use of chemical defoliants in Vietnam was known. Planes spraying jungle with herbicides was even shown in news footage. But the full truth of Agent Orange was a painful secret that unfolded slowly. Agent Orange was a powerful herbicide used by the US to kill forest cover and destroy enemy crops, with the intent to deny guerrillas hiding places and food. What wasn't taught or acknowledged during the war is that Agent Orange was highly toxic to humans, containing dioxin, one of the most dangerous chemicals known. Millions of Vietnamese were exposed, as were thousands of American and Allied troops. For years, the US government denied or downplayed the health effects, even as reports of unexplained illnesses, birth defects, and cancers mounted among veterans and Vietnamese civilians. It wasn't until much later that the US finally admitted the connection and began compensating some veterans, and only decades later offered assistance to affected Vietnamese. The scale is shocking. Some 20 million gallons of herbicides were dumped across Vietnam. The lasting health crisis was essentially covered up or ignored during and immediately after the war, a dark secret that left generations suffering in silence. To this day, the words Agent Orange carry an infamous legacy of how a war's deadly fallout was hidden from those who fought it. In a war of hearts and minds, the US tried some truly eerie psychological warfare. Operation Wandering Soul was a PSYOP campaign exploiting Vietnamese spiritual beliefs. In Vietnamese culture, there's an idea that if someone dies far from home or without proper burial, their soul wanders in torment. US engineers recorded an audio tape, codenamed Ghost Tape Number 10, filled with haunting wails, pretending to be the voices of dead Viet Cong fighters' spirits. At night, US forces would broadcast these ghostly sounds in the jungle, or from helicopters flying over Viet Cong-held areas. The wailing voices in Vietnamese implored their comrades to go home and cease fighting, or lamented that they were damned. The hope was to spook superstitious guerrillas into deserting, or at least demoralize them. It might sound absurd, but there are reports that in some cases it did frighten enemy troops. The existence of ghost tapes was not public knowledge at the time. It was a classified psychological operation. It's one of those bizarre wartime projects that came out later and makes people wonder, did that really happen? Yes, it did. The US literally tried to haunt the enemy to death. Another secret project was Operation Igloo White, a high-tech electronic surveillance network. Starting around 1968, the US dropped thousands of hidden sensors along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Some were seismic sensors that detected foot traffic, others were acoustic, and some even looked like fake jungle plants or animal droppings to blend in. These sensors transmitted signals to orbiting planes and to a computer center in Thailand, which then guided US bombers to interdict truck convoys. It was cutting-edge technology for the era, an electronic battlefield. At the time, this system was highly classified. The idea that IBM computers and remote sensors were directing bombs in real time was mind-blowing in the 1960s. While Igloo White had mixed results, the enemy adapted by finding the sensors or tricking them. It represents a secret side of the war. The US poured huge resources into a futuristic technological war that few back home even knew was being fought. The Vietnam War became a laboratory for unconventional methods. The US experimented with laser-guided bombs, a novelty then, napalm and white phosphorus, horrific incendiaries whose use and effects were not fully disclosed, and even considered chemical and biological agents for defoliation and anti-personnel use. There were rumors and later some evidence that both the US and North Vietnam at times engaged in limited use of poison gases in covert operations, though not on a massive scale. The US also deployed people sniffers, airborne devices that could detect ammonia in human sweat, to locate fighters in the jungle. Such gadgets were kept secret so the enemy couldn't counter them. Additionally, the Navy at one point trained dolphins to locate Viet Cong swimmers and sappers near harbors, a classified program blending biology and warfare. While not all these efforts were successful, they highlight how Vietnam was not just a guerrilla war, but a covert testing ground for every trick in the book. Many of these were kept hidden during the war, only to be revealed later in military archives or investigative journalism. All of these unconventional tactics show a side of the Vietnam War that's rarely taught. A war fought with ingenuity and desperation, where one side tried anything and everything in secret to gain an edge. From seeding clouds to summoning ghosts, from sensors in the soil to poisons in the foliage, the US war effort went down many shadowy paths. These secret programs raise ethical questions that still echo today, and they remind us how much of Vietnam's history unfolded behind a veil of classification and denial. If you learned about the Vietnam War in school, you likely heard about incidents like the My Lai massacre, where American troops killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians in 1968, as a shocking exception. What you probably didn't learn is that My Lai was not an isolated event. There were numerous atrocities committed by various sides during the war, and in many cases US authorities covered them up or kept them hidden from the public for years. The ugly reality of the ground war, especially the impact on Vietnamese civilians, was often swept under the rug. Uncovering these hidden crimes has been the work of journalists and historians long after the fact. My Lai, a hamlet in Quang Ngoc province, became infamous when it finally hit the news in late 1969, more than a year after it happened. On March 16, 1968, soldiers from the American Division's Charlie Company entered My Lai on a search and destroy mission. Finding no enemy combatants, they nonetheless massacred between 300 and 500 unarmed villagers, including women, children, and elderly. This horrific event might have remained buried if not for the courage of a whistleblower, a soldier named Ron Riddenhauer, who wrote letters to Congress, and investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, who broke the story. Why mention this well-known atrocity? Because the true secret was the extent of the cover-up. In the immediate aftermath, the Army's officers downplayed the incident, reporting it as a victory over 128 Viet Cong, when in fact the dead were all civilians. Higher-ups quietly closed an initial investigation. It took persistent insiders and the press to force the truth out. Even then, only one man, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted, and he served only a token amount of house arrest after presidential clemency. The My Lai story that is taught often omits how systematic the cover-up was, implicating officers up to the division level. And it begs the question, how many other My Lais happened that we never heard about? The uncomfortable answer is more than one. An example of an atrocity long hidden is the case of Tiger Force, an elite U.S. Army recon unit. In 1967, over the span of 7 months in the Central Highlands, Tiger Force soldiers committed a string of war crimes as bad as or worse than My Lai, but on a smaller, rolling scale. They routinely tortured and executed prisoners, beheaded and cut ears off villagers as trophies, and massacred unarmed men, women, and children. Army investigators later concluded that Tiger Force may have killed hundreds of civilians. This investigation, however, was kept secret. The Army quietly shelved the case in the 1970s without prosecuting anyone. For over 35 years, the Tiger Force atrocities remained a buried secret. It wasn't until 2003 that reporters from the Toledo Blade uncovered the classified files and exposed the truth to the public, winning a Pulitzer Prize for finally bringing this dark chapter to light. The fact that an entire Army unit could go on a prolonged rampage and that the military knew but kept it quiet is a chilling reminder of how much of Vietnam's brutal ground reality was concealed. The strategy of the US in Vietnam often revolved around body count, the notion that success was measured by how many enemy fighters were killed. This pressure led to indiscriminate firepower and, tragically, a high number of civilian deaths that were then falsely counted as enemy combatants. One operation, Operation Speedy Express, which ran from December 1968 to May 1969 in the Mekong Delta, highlights this. The 9th Infantry Division, led by Major General Julian Ewell, reported killing an astonishing 10,000-plus enemies in just a few months, with minimal U.S. losses. Only later did internal reports suggest that perhaps 5,000 to 7,000 of those killed were actually civilians. Night after night, helicopter gunships and artillery strikes would rake suspected enemy areas, often small villages, to achieve high body counts. This was essentially a My Lai a month, quietly papered over by statistics. At the time, the Army did not admit any wrongdoing. It awarded General Ewell another star instead. The Vietnamese peasants who suffered in these free fire zones remained nameless and voiceless. It was only in the post-war years that Army investigators and authors like Nick Turse, in Kill Anything That Moves, documented how widespread these hidden atrocities were. The chilling phrase, "kill anything that moves," was reportedly an unofficial directive in some operations, reflecting a mindset that led to countless civilian killings that never made headlines. To be sure, atrocities were not committed by Americans alone. The war saw terrible acts by all parties, which often went untaught in their full scope. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, for example, executed thousands of civilians suspected of collaborating with the enemy. Famously, during the Hue Massacre in 1968, Communist forces slaughtered an estimated 2,800 to 5,000 civilians and prisoners. The South Vietnamese government, US-backed, also ran brutal prisons and torture camps. The tiger cages of Con Son Island being one notorious example, where political prisoners, including women and teenage dissidents, were kept in tiny cages and tortured. This was exposed by American congressional aides in 1970, surprising many who assumed our side wouldn't do such things. And within US ranks, incidents of brutality, whether against Vietnamese or even against fellow soldiers, were far more common than acknowledged. Racial tensions and the stress of guerrilla war led to crimes ranging from rape to fragging, the murder of unpopular officers by their own men, often with a grenade. Over 700 fragging incidents were suspected, a sign of how the war disintegrated morale and discipline. Most of these events were hushed up, classified, or lost in a blur of daily violence. In the sanitized version of history, one hears about the heroism and the major battles, but not about soldiers losing their moral compass in a nightmare environment. In a little-known effort, the Pentagon quietly compiled a secret archive in the early 1970s, cataloging reported war crimes by US forces in Vietnam. Everything from massacres to assaults. This Vietnam War Crimes Working Group file included over 300 substantiated incidents and hundreds more unproven allegations. It was classified and not revealed to the public. When these files were eventually declassified decades later, they added proof that My Lai was part of a much larger pattern, not an anomaly. Yet because the military suppressed these findings at the time, the public narrative remained a few bad apples, rather than grappling with the systemic issues that allowed such atrocities. All of this underscores a grim truth. Much of the brutality of the Vietnam War was kept in the shadows. The American public, and indeed the world, were shielded from the full reality on the ground. Only years later have we begun to piece together how savagely the war was fought at the expense of civilians, and how officials often chose to hide or ignore these facts to protect their own image or avoid backlash. It's a harsh reminder that in war, truth truly is the first casualty. And in Vietnam, truth was buried under layers of secrecy and denial. Not all of the Vietnam War's secrets were in Vietnam. The conflict also sparked unprecedented covert activity within the United States, as the government struggled to deal with a growing anti-war movement and social upheaval. These aren't the kind of battlefield secrets we usually think of, but they are crucial to understanding the era and are seldom taught in standard histories of the war. The US government, ironically fighting for freedom abroad, engaged in serious abuses of freedom at home in connection to Vietnam. By the late 1960s, anti-war protests were erupting on college campuses and city streets across America. President Johnson, and later President Nixon, became convinced, without much evidence, that foreign communists must be behind the anti-war movement. This led to Operation Chaos, a highly secret CIA program to spy on American citizens deemed subversive. Starting in 1967, the CIA, barred by law from domestic operations, nonetheless compiled files on tens of thousands of Americans, student activists, journalists, civil rights leaders, you name it, trying to find links to foreign influence. Under Chaos, CIA agents infiltrated peace groups and sent reports back to Langley. They even tapped the phones and read the mail of certain U.S. citizens. This massive domestic espionage operation was completely hidden from the public and certainly not authorized by any court. It only came to light in the 1970s during post-Watergate investigations, the Church Committee in Congress. The revelation that the CIA had a subversives database on war critics was shocking and showed how Vietnam led the U.S. government to turn intelligence tools on its own people in violation of its principles. Alongside the CIA, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was running its own secret campaign known as COINTELPRO, the Counterintelligence Program. Originally started to disrupt Communist Party USA, COINTELPRO expanded to target anti-war groups, student organizers, and New Left organizations. The FBI went beyond surveillance. They actively tried to discredit and divide anti-war movements. Tactics included spreading false rumors, planting informants who acted as agent provocateurs, and even writing fake letters to break up marriages or reputations of movement leaders. One infamous example, the FBI sent an anonymous letter to Martin Luther King Jr., who had come out against the war, suggesting he kill himself as part of their campaign to neutralize him. COINTELPRO's dirty tricks were all secret until activists actually burglarized an FBI office in 1971 and exposed documents. Only then did Americans learn that their own government had been engaged in, essentially, a covert war against citizens exercising free speech. While not solely about Vietnam, civil rights and Black Panther activists were also big targets. The anti-war angle was a huge part of COINTELPRO. It's a sobering secret. While young Americans shouted, "Stop the war," agencies of their government were spying on them, smearing them, and treating peaceful dissent as enemy activity. Another rarely discussed aspect is how the government secretly tried to shape public opinion on the war. For instance, the Johnson administration in 1965 created a covert propaganda arm called the Office of Public Safety to push the official line in U.S. and foreign media. The CIA also had influence programs. It would, for example, pay for favorable news stories in foreign press that then filtered into U.S. news. The military invited friendly journalists and fed them good news of the war, while discouraging or even threatening those who reported negatives. There's also evidence that some returning U.S. POWs in the early 70s were coached on what to say to the media to portray their captivity in a certain light. These measures are not well known. We often hear that Vietnam was the first televised war that turned people against it. That's true to an extent, but behind the scenes, the government was desperately and secretly working to control the narrative until the weight of truth, Tet Offensive, My Lai, Pentagon Papers, collapsed the rosy facade. Even with all that has come to light, the Vietnam War retains mysteries and unresolved questions that continue to haunt those who look back. Part of the allure of examining secret history is confronting the nagging feeling that we still don't know everything, or that what we don't know might change our understanding. In the case of Vietnam, some controversies and theories remain, ranging from plausible but unproven suspicions to more far-out conspiracy claims. One of the longest-running Vietnam mysteries concerns the fate of U.S. prisoners of war, POWs, and the missing in action, MIAs. When the war ended in 1973, Vietnam repatriated 591 American POWs, but hundreds of U.S. servicemen were still unaccounted for. Over the years, there were persistent rumors and reports that some Americans were still alive, held captive in Vietnam or neighboring Laos long after the war. Families and activists pressed the U.S. government for answers, suspecting a cover-up or abandonment. Conspiracy theories blossomed that perhaps Washington didn't want to pay ransom or admit to secret operations, so they wrote off these men. The Rambo movie image of Americans left behind in camps became a cultural meme. Investigations in the 80s and 90s, including a Senate committee led by John Kerry and John McCain, concluded there was no credible evidence of surviving POWs left in captivity, though they didn't rule out that a small number might have been alive for a time after 1973. Still, many Americans remain unconvinced, believing there are classified files and satellite photos that tell a different story. True or not, the POW MIA issue illustrates how the Vietnam War's secrecy bred lasting distrust. It's an emotional subject. Did our government knowingly abandon any of its own soldiers? Officially, no. But the lack of closure continues to spur doubt and suspicion. Another fundamental question: what exactly was the real aim of the Vietnam War, and was the public sold a false bill of goods? Officially, it was to defend South Vietnam from communist aggression, part of the Cold War containment strategy and the domino theory, fearing if Vietnam fell, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. But as secrets emerged, some wondered if other motives were at play. Was it a proxy war to intimidate the Soviet Union and China, as some Pentagon Papers hints suggest? Was it about economic interests, keeping markets open, or protecting certain resources? For instance, Vietnam had rubber and tin. Nearby, Indonesia had oil. Stability in the region was economically important. More darkly, critics ask, was the war prolonged because powerful players profited from it? The military-industrial complex boomed during Vietnam. Defense contractors made fortunes on helicopters, bombs, and napalm. It's the stuff of many conspiracy theories that these interests pressured politicians to keep the war going. While direct evidence of such a scheme is scant, the notion isn't far-fetched to many, given President Eisenhower's famous warning about the military-industrial complex. When one looks at decisions like escalating in 1965 or invading Cambodia in 1970, one can ask, were those truly for military necessity, or were there hidden agendas and ego-driven politics? Vietnam leaves that lingering question. Was it a tragic miscalculation, or something more cynical? The answer may depend on one's interpretation of the secret memos and tapes, many of which show leaders privately admitting the war was unwinnable even as they sent more troops. If nothing else, those contradictions remain a perplexing legacy. We've touched on CIA activities, but it's worth noting that a great deal about the CIA's role in Vietnam is still classified or murky. We know about the CIA's direct involvement in things like the Phoenix program and the Laos secret war. But CIA archives may hold even more surprises. For example, covert operations in North Vietnam. Did the CIA have any hand in the mysterious 1967 spark of the Buddhist uprising in Hue, or in fostering any internal dissent in the North? Some claim there were attempts to create sabotage or resistance networks in the North, but details are sparse. Also, the extent of CIA's knowledge, and perhaps complicity in Southeast Asia's heroin trade, the so-called Golden Triangle of opium, remains partly speculative. We know heroin production boomed in Laos and Burma during the war, some of it ending up in GI's veins. Was this merely an unintended byproduct? Or did any covert funding streams tap into that drug trade? Authors like Alfred McCoy have argued the CIA at least turned a blind eye because its local allies, like Laotian warlord Vang Pao, were deeply involved in opium. The CIA, of course, denies official involvement. Until more files are declassified, questions linger about just how dirty the covert side of the war got. The fog of war in Vietnam produced many incidents still debated. For instance, the friendly fire tragedy of Operation Tailwind in 1970, a secret raid in Laos. A 1998 CNN report claimed sarin nerve gas was used to kill American defectors, causing a scandal. CNN retracted the story under pressure, but some wonder if there was a kernel of truth in some secret operation. Or consider the 1968 Huey's incident, when a U.S. helicopter crew allegedly witnessed Korean troops, South Korea fought alongside Americans, massacring civilians. Was it covered up diplomatically? And there are geopolitical mysteries like how close did China come to intervening? We now know China had tens of thousands of troops in North Vietnam in support roles, a semi-secret at the time. Each new declassification or memoir can reveal something startling. Just recently, documents showed that in 1972, as Nixon mined North Vietnam's harbors, the Soviet Union had a nuclear submarine nearby that came perilously close to conflict, a hidden brush with World War III. Vietnam was full of these near-invisible turning points. As historians continue digging, there's always the chance a new secret comes out that changes our understanding yet again. In essence, Vietnam remains a cautionary tale with loose ends. It's been over 50 years, yet scholars and seekers of truth are still chasing leads, still trying to answer unanswered questions about that war. This enduring sense of mystery is partly because so much was kept hidden in the first place. When a government and military hide the truth, it can take generations to piece it together, if ever. That's why Vietnam, more than many wars, feels like a puzzle that we're still solving. And perhaps that's one of the biggest lessons. The truth will eventually surface, and when it does, it can fundamentally alter how we see a conflict. For Vietnam, much of that truth is only now widely known, and some of it, maybe, is yet to be discovered. The Vietnam War was a conflict fought on two levels: the war that the world saw and the war behind closed doors, the secret strategies, denials, and dark realities. We've pulled back the curtain on many of these Vietnam War secrets, and it's clear that the official story we were taught barely scratched the surface. From secret bombings and clandestine death squads to political treachery and withheld truths, the Vietnam era fundamentally shook Americans' faith in their leaders and institutions. And small wonder, as we've seen, much of what was going on was intentionally kept from the public or outright distorted. Why were we never taught these things? Some were classified for national security, some were covered up out of shame or fear of backlash, and some simply challenge the comforting narratives nations build about themselves. But as uncomfortable as these truths may be, they are essential to fully understanding what Vietnam was and what it did to everyone involved, Vietnamese and Americans alike. The war's hidden history also serves as a warning. When governments conceal facts and operate without transparency, costly mistakes and moral quagmires multiply. The legacy of Vietnam's secrets contributed to a lasting skepticism toward authority, a healthy skepticism, many would argue, given what was learned. In the end, the Vietnam War's untaught history forces us to ask tough questions. What really happened? And could things have been different if the truth had been known sooner? How did these buried truths affect the outcome of the war and the lives of millions? And importantly, what lessons do they hold for us today about power, honesty, and accountability? As we reflect on the secrets of the Vietnam War, we honor the idea that history should be illuminated, not hidden in shadow. Only by understanding these buried stories can we hope to learn from them, to ensure that future generations won't have to wait decades to discover the truth behind the decisions made in their name. The Vietnam War is over, but its secrets remind us that the past isn't always what it seems. There are always more layers to uncover. As this video has shown, the truth of Vietnam is a mosaic of courageous revelations and sobering realizations. It's a tale of war not just in the jungles, but in the minds of those who fought and the back rooms of those who led. And it's a stark lesson in why we must always keep asking questions, because you never know what hidden history lies beneath the surface of official accounts. Stay curious, stay critical, and remember, the stories we aren't taught are often the ones we most need to hear